welcome to Modern Era Research by Ishana, Andi, and Shin. So our guiding question is, what is the prevailing worldviews of the period and how are they reflected on in the literature of the time? Because of many hardships of World War I and II, there was a very hard shift in literature, from lighthearted to darker and more cynical, often featuring themes of alienation and despair.
So in the tab gender roles, we see the gender roles of men and women in the US and Europe throughout the decades between 1914 and 1945. So in this tab you have each of the decades and how the gender roles change throughout the time period. For example, between 1914 and 1919, the gender roles were very different from the 1920s because during World War I, women were expected to have more jobs that men had while they were off at war, and in 1920s, the women had to go back home to take care of the children. In the social economic tab, you can click either social or economic. In the social tab, you have the decades again from 1914 to 1945. Each of the decades shows the main social aspects of society in the US and in Europe. So, for example, in the US in the 1920s, the main thing was the Red Scare, where the US was afraid of the communism from Europe moving over to their country. In the economics tab, you see the booms and the bust of the economies of the US and Europe throughout this era. So you have the decades, starting with 1914 to 1919, 1920s, 1930s, and then 1940 to 1945. You see the different aspects of society and the economy and what the people were buying at that time period.
So this is the religion tab, and during the modern era, basically every American belonged to an organized religion. Most people were Christian though. Denominations were often divided based on race. There was less of a focus on the supernatural or miracles, and logic and reasoning was implemented in most aspects of Christianity. And because the world was becoming more materialistic and secular, the focus for religion was mostly like how to live a dedicated Christian life even in all these distractions. So for political, in America there were two major presidential administrations during this time, Woodrow Wilson and Franklin D. Roosevelt. During Wilson's presidency, there were a lot of new progressive policies, and after World War I, there was a progression of conservatism in the United States. FDR was known for his New Deal, which focused on relief, reform, and recovery after the Great Depression. In Europe, Christian democracies were dominant in France, Germany, and Italy, but after each World War, there was either a shift or a break in political parties. So, world events. There were a lot of major world events during this time period. In America, there was obviously the Great Depression, and although it was located in America and affected the American stock market, it actually affected the entire world. World War I and World War II were probably the most major events in the modern era, if not in the entire century. And the 1920s was the beginning of the Jazz Age as well. Seminal works of the time. So due to so many world-changing events going on, there were also many landmark pieces that basically defined the era. Some examples included T.S. Eliot's Wasteland, which basically called for redemption in a time of spiritual emptiness. Another is James Joyce's Ulysses. This story emphasizes individual thought and reasoning as the character's mental process is described throughout the entire story. There's also Aldous Huxley's Brave New World, which is shockingly cynical and clearly dominates with the dark tones of war. Virginia Woolf is also a major contributor with her many daring pieces of fiction during this era. And just a few, although she wrote a lot of books, just a few include To the Lighthouse, The Waves, and Between the Acts.
This is the arts movement. Throughout the era, there were many different arts movements that took place, such as Cubism, Surrealism, Art Deco, and Abstract Expressionism. Cubism was a highly influential visual art style in the 20th century. Surrealism is a movement in art and literature which is sought to release creative potential and unconscious mind. Art Deco was a movement that affected architecture, and Abstract Expressionism is a form of abstract instead of following a cubist geometrical idiom. This is the literature tab. The modernist period in English literature occupied the years from shortly after the beginning of the 20th century through roughly 1945. In broad terms, this period was marked by sudden and unexpected breaks from traditional ways of viewing the world. This is a literary themes tab. Literary themes in this era varied from people's social and economic struggles all the way from World War II. Writers who wrote about their lives and other people's struggles about the outcomes and what was happening. This is the important authors tab. The authors throughout the decades wrote timeless classics which portray the modern era, such as Sinclair Lewis, John Steinbeck, Thomas Wolfe, and William Faulkner. Authors wrote novels and short stories expressing their resentment and towards materialism and individualism that was rampant during this era.